The night my ex-husband tried to sell me for $280,000. I was still wearing the cardigan I'd worn to my last patient's house that afternoon. I had gone to that meeting believing Grant only wanted to talk about the storage unit we still shared, believing the years of lying were finally behind us because our divorce papers had been signed 14 months ago. Then he opened the door of a private club I had no business standing inside, and I understood, before anyone spoke a single word, that I had walked into a room where I was not the guest. I was the currency. The man behind the desk did not look up right away. He was reading a leather folder with the patience of someone who has already read the worst thing the world can hand him. And Grant, my Grant, the man who once cried when I had pneumonia, stepped forward and said, "280, that's what I owe. She's a trained caregiver, she's steady, she'll work off the rest. Take her, Massimo, and we're square." I did not scream. I did not move. Somewhere far away from my body, I heard my own voice ask, very quietly, "Grant, what have you done?" He would not look at me. That was the part I could not get past. Not the room, not the two silent men by the door, not the leather folder. It was that my ex-husband, who had known the shape of my sleeping face for 8 years, could not lift his eyes from a spot on the carpet 6 inches to the left of my shoe. My name is Beth Calder. I am 32 years old, and until that night I believed the worst thing my ex-husband could ever do to me had already been done, 3 years earlier, when I found the second mortgage he had taken out on my mother's house without asking. I was wrong. There was a worse thing. There is always a worse thing when the man is Grant Rowan. And the reason you are hearing this story at all is because the man behind that desk, the man half of Philadelphia was afraid to say out loud in public, closed the leather folder, looked at me the way a person looks at a wound, and refused. "No," Massimo Arcuri said. His voice was quieter than I expected, almost gentle, which somehow made it more frightening. "The debt is yours, Grant. It stays yours. Women are not currency in this room, and they are not currency in any room I walk into. Get her a coat. She is cold." I did not understand yet that his refusal was the reason I was still breathing. I only understood, watching Grant's face go the color of old paper, that whatever bargain he had come here to make had just collapsed on top of him. And I understood something else, watching Massimo watch me. He was angry. Not at me, not even quite at Grant. He was angry the way a person is angry when they have been asked to become something they have spent 30 years refusing to be. A man who buys women. He looked, in that moment, less like the boss of anything and more like someone who had just been personally insulted in a way that could not be walked back. Before I go any further, if a stranger has ever stepped between you and someone who was supposed to protect you, hit that like button so more people find this story, and stay with me, because the reason Massimo Arcuri refused to take me is not the reason you think, and the reason my ex-husband brought me there in the first place is going to break your heart before it makes you angry. Grant did not leave quietly. He begged. He is very good at begging, my ex-husband. He learned it during 8 years of marriage, every time I caught him at another table, another bookmaker, another lie stacked on the last one. He said, "Massimo, please, they are going to kill me, you understand? They are going to actually kill me tonight if I do not walk out of here clean. You have to help me. You have to take her. She will not fight it." Massimo did not move. He said, "Then you should have thought of that before you brought your wife into my building." "Ex-wife," Grant said quickly. "Ex-wife," as if the word made it better, as if the paperwork excused the porch he had led me across. That was when Massimo asked the question that changed the shape of the night. He said, "Grant, look at me. Who else did you tell about her?" Grant's mouth opened and closed. Massimo waited, and there is a kind of waiting some men can do that is louder than a shout. Finally, Grant whispered, "Sloane's people. I gave them her address. I told them her schedule. I told them what time she gets home from the Miller house on Tuesdays. I had to give them something. They said if I brought her here tonight, they'd forgive the interest." I felt the floor tilt. I want you to understand something because it matters for everything that comes after. I had been on my own for 14 months. I had rebuilt my client list. I had scraped together first month, last month, and a security deposit for a walk-up in South Philly with a lock I had installed myself. I had taught my hands to stop shaking every time a car door slammed outside. And Grant Rowan, in one afternoon, had given every piece of that safety to men whose names he could not even pronounce correctly. Massimo turned to me. He said, "Ms. Calder, I am asking, not telling. Will you come with me tonight? Not as payment, not as anything owed. As a person my organization is currently keeping alive." I have replayed that sentence in my head 1,000 times since. It was the first time in 8 years a man with more power than me in a room had asked instead of decided. I said yes. Not because I trusted him. I did not trust him. I said yes because Grant was crying now, actually crying, and I knew my ex-husband well enough to know he was not crying for me. He was crying because his plan, whatever it had been, was not working. And a woman learns, after enough years, that when the man who used to promise to die for her is crying about his own inconvenience, the safest place in the building is anywhere he is not. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city, up a long private road that curled through trees older than the country. I remember counting the guardhouses. I remember the way the gate closed behind us without a sound. I remember thinking, in the strange calm you feel when fear has finally worn itself out, that I had traded one kind of cage for another, and I did not yet know which one had softer bars. Then the front door opened, and a small, silver-haired woman in a silk robe leaned on a carved cane and said, in an accent that had crossed an ocean, "Massimo, you are late, and you have brought a girl who is soaked through. Bring her to the kitchen. I will not have hypothermia in this house tonight." That was Lucia. 78 years old, 6 weeks out of hip surgery, and the only person I ever met who could give an order to Massimo Arcuri and be obeyed inside of a second. She did not ask why I was there. She looked at the bruise on the inside of my wrist where Grant had gripped me too hard on the drive over, and she looked at the way I stood a little too close to the doorway, and she said, "You will stay in the yellow room. It has a lock on the inside. The key is in the drawer. Nobody in this house will touch that door without your permission. Am I understood, Massimo?" And Massimo, feared through 5 states, said, "Yes, Zia." I had heard men called sir before. I had heard men called boss. I had never, until that hallway, heard a man called nephew, in a voice that softened every hard edge in the room without asking his permission to do so. It told me something about the house I was standing inside of before I had finished taking off my coat. I did not sleep that first night. I sat on the edge of a bed in a room that smelled like lavender and old paper, and I listened to a house I did not understand breathing around me. Somewhere far off in the corridor, a clock chimed the quarter hours. Somewhere closer, a floorboard settled the way old houses settle in the cold. Around 3 in the morning, I opened my mother's brooch, the small oval cameo she had left me, the only thing of value Grant had never managed to sell out from under me. I held it in my palm the way I always did when I needed her, and I whispered the thing I had been telling myself for 14 months. I am nobody's property. I am nobody's payment. I am nobody's debt. I did not know, holding that piece of oval, bone-white porcelain against my chest, that the words I was whispering were being carried on invisible legs down the corridor and out over the walls of the estate into the ear of a man named Victor Sloan, who was writing them down in the margin of a notebook 40 miles away. If you are watching this and you have ever had to say those words to yourself in the dark, you already know how the rest of this story feels. Morning came in through tall windows I did not remember opening. Lucia was already downstairs at a table set for 2. She patted the chair beside her and said, "I understand you are a therapist for old bones. Good. My surgeon says I must walk. My nephew says I must rest. I say I must eat first and argue with both of them later. Sit." I sat. I ate. And by the end of the meal I had agreed, without quite realizing when, to help her with her rehabilitation for as long as I was under that roof. Massimo appeared in the doorway near the end of breakfast. He did not come in. He watched Lucia laugh at something I had said, and something in his face changed the way a wall changes when a window is finally cut into it. He said, "Ms. Calder, when you are finished, my head of security would like to walk the grounds with you, so you know which doors open, which do not, and which windows you must not stand in front of." I said, "Beth is fine." He said, "Beth. Just my name. And then he left. For 3 days, nothing happened, which was itself a strange kind of something. I worked with Lucia every morning. I taught her the small, humiliating exercises hip patients hate, the ones that ask a proud woman to lift a foot 2 inches off the floor and hold it. And Lucia hated them and did them anyway because she was that kind of woman. Massimo took his meals with us when he could. He asked questions about her progress and listened to the answers. He did not ask me anything about Grant. He did not ask me anything about the divorce. He treated me, I realized on the 3rd afternoon, exactly the way a man treats a guest whose story is not his to open. On the 4th day, everything shifted. I had taken Lucia to a physical therapy office in the city, a small, quiet place her surgeon recommended, and we had used a private medical entrance around the back of the building that Massimo's men had cleared in advance. Exactly 4 people in the world knew we would be at that entrance at that time. Massimo, his head of security, the driver, and me. When we came back out, a black sedan was parked across the alley with 2 men in the front seat pretending to read a newspaper, the way people pretend when they have never actually read a newspaper in their lives. Massimo's driver saw them before I did. He got us into the car without a word. Lucia's hand tightened on mine on the drive back, and she did not let go until we were through the 2nd gate of the estate. That night, Massimo did not eat with us. He came to the yellow room instead, and he knocked, and he waited on the other side of the door until I opened it. He said, "Beth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think before you answer. Since you arrived at this house, has anything of yours been moved? A book, a hairbrush, anything at all?" I thought about it. I thought hard. And then I remembered, sick to my stomach, that my mother's brooch had been on the nightstand 2 mornings ago, and on the writing desk yesterday. And I had told myself I must have moved it in my sleep, because who else would touch a thing like that? I told him. His jaw tightened. He said, "Do not go into any room you have not already been in. Do not open any drawer you have not already opened. Not because I do not trust you, because someone in this house is trying very hard to make it look like you cannot be trusted." I did not sleep again that night either. Comment below and tell me, honestly, if a man you barely knew had said those words to you in a house full of strangers, would you have stayed, or would you have run for the first road out? Because I stayed. And I want you to know I stayed for a reason that had nothing to do with fear. I stayed because Lucia had asked me that afternoon very quietly, over tea, whether I had noticed that Celeste had been in her sitting room going through her sewing basket. And I had said no, and Lucia had said, "Neither had I, until this morning, and Celeste has been my companion for 11 years. The next morning, Lucia asked to see my brooch. I brought it to her. She turned it in her small, careful hands the way she turned everything, the way a jeweler's daughter turns things because her father taught her to. And after a very long minute, she set it down on the tablecloth between us and said, "Beth, this is not the piece I saw yesterday. The clasp is wrong, and there is no repair mark on the back. Your mother had this piece repaired. I would have staked my life on that mark." I stared at her. I said, "That is impossible. It has not left my sight in a year." Lucia said, "Then someone put a different one in your sight, and you never noticed the switch. When?" I closed my eyes. I said, "Grant, the night of the club. He hugged me before we went in. He said he was sorry for what was about to happen." Massimo's security chief opened the replica an hour later on a workbench in a room I did not know existed underneath the house. He wore small round glasses and worked with the patient hands of a man who had diffused worse things than a piece of jewelry. Inside the small, hollowed cameo, held in place by a bead of clear resin, was something the size of a lentil, black, with 2 hair-thin wires coiled around it like a sleeping insect. A transmitter, voice-activated, long range, cheap enough to be disposable, sophisticated enough to have listened to every conversation I'd had in that house since I walked through the door. He set it on a white cloth between us, and he said, without looking up, "This is not amateur work, Mr. Arcuri. Whoever placed this understood exactly how close it needed to sit to her collarbone to catch her voice through a closed door. I want you to imagine what that felt like. Every private thing I had whispered to a mirror, every argument I had with myself at 3 in the morning, Every kind word Lucia had said to me at breakfast. Every promise Massimo had made me at the doorway of the yellow room. All of it had been walking through the walls of that estate on invisible legs, carrying my voice out to a man whose name I did not yet know. Massimo asked me, very quietly, if I had known. I said no. He said, "I believe you." Just that. And in 8 years of marriage to Grant Rowan, no one had ever said those 3 words to me and meant them the way this man meant them now. Here is where the story turned, and where I stopped being someone the story happened to. I told Massimo I wanted to help. He said no. He said I had already been hurt enough. He said I could be on a flight anywhere in the country by morning under a name that would take a year to trace. He said his people would set me up with an apartment, a new client list, a life that started tomorrow. I heard him out, and when he was finished, I said, "You listen to me, Mr. Arcuri. That man, my ex-husband, walked me into a room to trade my body for his mistakes. And whoever put this thing inside my mother's face expected me to die in this house so their story would end clean. I am not evacuating. I am not disappearing. I want to know who is on the other end of that transmitter, and I want them to hear me help you catch them." Lucia from the doorway said, "She is staying, Massimo. She has earned the right to finish this." He looked at both of us for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and something in the shape of his shoulders changed. The way a man changes when he stops being alone in a problem he has been carrying by himself for a week. The plan we made that night is the reason I am able to tell you this story now. We would leave the transmitter working. We would leave it exactly where it had always been, on the nightstand in the yellow room, on the tablecloth at breakfast, on the collar of my sweater during physical therapy. And we would feed it, patiently, one careful lie at a time. Massimo would arrange loud arguments in the hallway about a shipment that did not exist, going through a warehouse that had been empty for 2 years. Lucia and I would talk over tea about a wing of the estate that had been closed since her sister died, a wing whose corridor connected to the room where Massimo supposedly slept. It did not, of course. Massimo had not slept in that wing in 15 years, but the transmitter did not know that, and neither, we suspected, did the person listening. Celeste noticed the change in me before anyone else. Celeste, Lucia's companion of 11 years, with her soft gray dresses and her invisible way of carrying tea trays, and her habit of standing just close enough to a doorway to hear what was said inside a room. Celeste, whose keys unlocked every door in the house because Lucia had trusted her with them. I do not blame Lucia. Lucia will spend the rest of her life not blaming herself. But Celeste, we learned, had been resentful for a long time. Underpaid, she believed. Unseen. Passed over for a raise she felt she had earned 3 winters running, watching a family she had bathed and fed and cared for treat her the way a household treats a piece of good furniture that has always been in the same corner. And when a man named Victor Sloan had approached her at a farmer's market 6 months ago and offered her enough money to retire on, all she had to do was open a few doors and move a few of my belongings into rooms I had never been in. She said yes. I did not know any of that yet. I only knew, watching Celeste refill Lucia's teacup on the 7th morning, that her hand shook a little when I said, casually, that Massimo had told me the West Wing corridor would be repainted next week. I saw her hand shake, and I saw her, 20 minutes later, walking a little too quickly toward the greenhouse where she liked to make her private phone calls. Massimo's chief of security recorded the whole conversation from a directional microphone across the garden. Celeste told the voice on the other end that the West Wing was empty tonight, that the corridor behind the linen closet was unwatched, that Massimo would be sleeping in his rooms alone. Every word of it was a lie we had built for her to carry, and she carried it beautifully. The next part is the part where I have to ask you to trust me, because the next part is the one that hurt. Massimo told me, 48 hours before the trap closed, that he was going to have to publicly turn on me. He said, "Beth, Celeste has to see it. The men outside the walls have to hear it. Grant has to believe it. If any one of them doubts, they do not come. And if they do not come, this house is never safe again." I said, "How ugly does it need to be?" He said, "Ugly enough that if you ever want to walk out my front door afterward, no one in this house would blame you." I said, "Then do it." He said, "Beth." I said, do it, Massimo. But when it is over, I want my mother's brooch, my real one. I do not care what you have to do to get it. If you are still with me, please hit that subscribe button quickly and quietly, because what happens next is the piece of this story I have never told anyone, and I want you here for the end of it. The argument happened in the front hall, where every soft surface in the house carried sound down to the kitchen where Celeste was polishing silver. Massimo did it perfectly. He accused me of things I had not done, of leading strangers to the medical entrance, of walking Lucia into a schedule I had leaked myself. He said things I know he did not mean, and some of the things he said were so precise, so cruel, so exactly the shape of my worst fear about him, that I understood he had listened, really listened, at the doorway of the yellow room for a week, and used my own vocabulary against me. I cried real tears. I did not have to fake them. I told him he was exactly the man everyone was afraid he was. He told me to be out of his house by morning. Celeste heard every word. I was driven off the property at dawn in a car with tinted windows, escorted to a small hotel near the airport, and left there with a bag Lucia had packed herself. Inside the bag, wrapped in tissue paper, was a note in Lucia's careful handwriting that said only, "The corridor will be empty. Stay near the phone." I sat on the edge of a strange bed and waited, and 40 miles away, on the estate I had just been thrown out of, Victor Sloane's men were moving into position around a wing of the house Massimo had not slept in for 15 years. Grant came to the meeting himself. That is the part I still think about. He did not have to. Victor Sloane had told him to stay clear until the debt was cleared, but Grant Rowan had always needed to watch the moment his lies paid out, the way an addict needs to watch the wheel spin one more time. He drove himself to the abandoned carriage house at the back of the Arcuri property, because Victor had promised him a briefcase there at midnight. He walked in expecting a briefcase. He walked in expecting to hear that Beth Calder, his ex-wife, the mother he never had and the wife he never deserved, was already dead inside the estate, blamed for the assassination of Massimo Arcuri. Permanent silence guaranteed by a body no one would look for. What Grant walked into was a room with the lights on. Massimo sitting in a wooden chair against the far wall, Lucia, upright on her cane, standing beside him, and me, in the door I had come in through 5 minutes earlier, my mother's real brooch, the one with the tiny repair mark on the back, pinned to the collar of the same cardigan I had worn the night he tried to sell me. I said, "Hello, Grant." He did not run. There was nowhere to run to. Every exit of the carriage house had been sealed. Every one of Victor's men, gathering in the wrong wing of the estate 300 yards away, had already been separated from their weapons by Massimo's people during the very breach they thought was theirs. Grant sat down on the floor. He did not even fall. He just sat, as if his knees had finally admitted the thing his mouth had been lying about for 6 months, as if every muscle in his body had at last agreed with the truth his lips were still refusing to say out loud. He said, "Beth, please, Beth, you have to understand, they were going to kill me. They said they would kill me if I did not." I crouched in front of him. I did not touch him. I said, "Grant, I want you to listen to me very carefully, because I am only going to say this once. You did not sell me because you were afraid. You sold me because Victor Sloane offered to cancel your debt and pay you $60,000 on top of it if you could get me inside this house wearing a transmitter. You knew what would happen to me here. You picked out the replica brooch yourself, and you hugged me before you walked me into that club because you already knew I would never come out." He started to shake. I stood up. I said, "That is what Massimo has been recording for 20 minutes now, on the same transmitter you paid to have planted in my mother's face." Massimo stood then. He said, "Grant Rowan, you are not going to prison, because I do not use prisons. You are also not going to die, because Beth has asked me not to kill you, and I have found, recently, that I am unable to refuse this woman anything. But you are going to sign every document my attorneys put in front of you tomorrow morning. You are going to return the equity you stole from the Calder house. You are going to disappear from this city and from her life so completely that if she ever again hears the sound of your name, it will be as an announcement of your funeral. Do you understand me?" Grant understood. Victor Sloane was found in the West Wing corridor with his hands already zip-tied. Celeste was found in the kitchen, still polishing the same fork she had been polishing at dinner, and she wept when Lucia walked in without a cane. Lucia had left the cane against the wall. She was walking, slowly but on her own, for the first time in 6 weeks, and she looked at Celeste, and she said only, "You should have asked me for the money. I would have given it to you." Celeste covered her face with a napkin. We drove back to the main house at 3 in the morning. Massimo drove. I sat in the passenger seat with Lucia's arm through mine in the back because Lucia had refused to be left behind for a single minute of any of it. Nobody spoke for the first 20 minutes. The road curved through the trees the same way it had curved on the night I arrived, but the trees looked different now, closer somehow, less like a wall around a stranger's house and more like a border around one I was allowed to know. Then Massimo said quietly, without looking at me, "Beth, I owe you an apology." I said, "For which part?" He said, "For all of it. For not telling you what you were walking into. For using your name the way I used it in that hallway. For asking you to stand in a room across from your ex-husband when I could have kept you out of it." I said, "Massimo, I stood in that room because I chose to. That is the only reason anything I have done in the last 2 weeks has meant anything. Do not take that from me by apologizing for it now." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Understood." In the morning he came to the yellow room and knocked, the way he had every morning, and he waited for me to open the door. He was carrying 2 things. The first was my mother's brooch, my real one, the one with the tiny repair mark on the back where a jeweler in Fishtown had fixed the clasp when I was 11 years old. Massimo had bought it back from Victor Sloane's holdings that morning at a price he did not tell me. He set it in my palm without ceremony. He said, "This is yours. It has always been yours." I did not cry. I had cried enough for one lifetime the night before. The second thing he set in my palm was a key. Small, brass, worn smooth. He said, "This is a key to the front door of the Arcuri estate. It opens from the outside without an escort. It closes from the inside without permission. It is yours if you want it. And if you do not want it, I am also holding, on the desk in my study, the keys to your apartment in South Philly, which has been repaired, repainted, and resecured at my expense with no signature required from you. Whichever key you take, you take. Whichever one you leave, you leave. There is nothing owed between us, Beth. Not a dollar, not a debt, not an obligation of any kind." He set both keys on the writing desk. Then he left. I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time. I thought about my mother, who had raised me in a house where my father had believed loving her gave him the right to spend her paycheck. She had worn that same brooch to work every morning for 27 years, and she had told me once, when I was 9, that the small repair mark on the back was the only place on the piece where a jeweler had ever been allowed to leave his own hand behind. Everything else, she had said, was original. I thought about Grant, who had believed the same thing about me for 8 years, and who had almost gotten me killed proving it. I thought about Lucia, downstairs, drinking her coffee, walking without her cane, calling my name up the staircase because breakfast was ready and she had waited long enough. And I thought about Massimo, who had been asked one time in his life to accept a woman as payment, and who had refused, and who was now, in the middle of the most powerful house in the city, offering me both of my exits at once and letting me choose. I went to my apartment first. I want you to know that. I did not go straight to him. I went to South Philly. I stood in the rooms Massimo had quietly restored. New locks, fresh paint, my books arranged on the shelves in the order I had left them, my mother's photograph on the mantel, dusted, my winter coat, which I had left over the back of the kitchen chair the morning Grant called and asked me to meet him at the club, folded neatly on the couch as if it had been waiting patiently for me to come back for it. It was a beautiful apartment. It was safe. It was mine. And I understood, standing in the middle of it, that safety is not the same thing as home. Safety is what a good lock gives you. Home is what happens when someone leaves the door unlocked because they trust you to close it behind yourself. I locked my apartment door. I put the key in my coat pocket. I put my mother's brooch through the collar of my cardigan, and I drove the 40 minutes back up the long, private road, and I used the small brass key on the front door of the Arcuri estate for the first time. Nobody was waiting in the foyer. Nobody escorted me. Lucia was in the sunroom, in a chair by the window, and she looked up when she heard my footsteps, and she smiled without a word, because there was no word for what she wanted to say that had not already been said between us. Massimo was in the library. He heard me in the doorway, and he did not stand. He did not come across the room to meet me. He simply set down the book he had been reading, and he watched me walk toward him, and he made room beside him on the long leather bench under the window, the way a man makes room for a person he has been waiting for. I sat down. He did not ask me why I had come back. He did not ask me to explain the key in my hand. He looked at the brooch on my collar for a long moment, and then he looked at my face, and I saw him decide, without a word, not to ask what the drive to the apartment had felt like, or what I had thought about standing inside those clean, quiet rooms alone. He put his coat around my shoulders because I was cold from the drive, and he said, "Welcome home, Beth." Just that. If this story reached you tonight, tell me in the comments, was it the moment Massimo refused, or the moment I refused to be evacuated, that told you I was going to make it out? Because for me it was neither. For me it was the morning he handed me 2 keys and did not tell me which one to use. And if you have ever needed someone to hand you your own choice back without a price on it, please subscribe. Because the next story I am going to tell you is about the woman who taught me how to walk out of a room without asking permission first. And her name was Lucia Arcuri, and I owe her everything. My name is Beth Calder. I am 32 years old. My ex-husband tried to sell me for $280,000. A dangerous man refused and took me home. And in a house I entered as a stranger under someone else's debt, I became, for the first time in my life, a woman who lived at an address that belonged only to her because she had chosen it. Grant Rowan is gone. Victor Sloan is gone. Celeste is gone. The transmitter that was hidden inside my mother's face was destroyed in a small fire in the carriage house behind the estate on the night everything ended. My mother's real brooch sits on the writing desk in the yellow room, which is not the yellow room anymore because I moved my books into it, and Lucia hung a photograph of her sister on the wall above the bed. And Massimo painted the doorframe himself one Sunday afternoon because I had said, in passing, that I had always liked the color of the sky just before rain. The key to the front door hangs on a hook in the kitchen next to Lucia's. My apartment in South Philly is still mine. I go there sometimes. I water the plants. I sleep in my own bed. And then I drive the 40 minutes back up the long private road, and I let myself in without asking anyone. And Massimo makes room beside him on the bench under the window in the library, and Lucia calls up the staircase that dinner is ready. The man who first took me home to save my life is the man whose home I freely choose to share. And nobody in that house, not the man at the head of the table, not the woman with the cane by the window, not the woman with her mother's brooch on her collar, owes any of the others a single thing. Which is, I have learned, the only kind of home worth walking into with your own key.